Go.
Hey, everybody. I'm Jeremiah. I'm CEO at Prefect. This is Chris, or I don't know where Chris is, but this is Chris. He's our CTO. Before we dive in, I want to introduce a relatively new member of our team, Chris Reuter, who's just joined us. There he is. Chris is our head of growth. He's going to be helping us moderate today's conversation. He'll be monitoring the chat. I think we've got this going on in a whole bunch of different places. So I really hope that we have an opportunity to answer any questions that you have, all the questions that you have. We have a lot to talk about. We don't have a lot of time to talk about it in, so let's see what we can knock out. The most important thing that we're here to talk about, though, is the Prefect Orion announcement. This is, I mean, we couldn't be more excited about this. This represents so much for us and our team. For Chris and myself personally, this is the culmination of a conversation that we started having close to 2 years ago at this point. We, as you can imagine, we're always talking. We're always talking about everything. What can we improve? What new use cases can we tackle? What can we do better? What would we love to do? And Prefect is very much an evolving product. But this started as a conversation in which Chris identified that increasingly our product is our API, which is to say it's a very modern way of expressing business logic that you want enacted on code or in any other form. And you're giving us those instructions, and we need to carry that out, whether it's Prefect Cloud, Prefect Server, whatever form you've deployed Prefect in. And we started really exploring, what does that mean? What does it mean to have an API-first orchestrator? Because this is very different than how Prefect Core works today, which is very much a code-first orchestrator in which the code is taken and we do all this stuff to it, and we send it to a backend. And that idea took root. And we had many conversations exploring all different variations of it. And we kept coming up against one reason or another that we just weren't really satisfied with the user experience or the developer experience. And then one day, months later, as we were exploring it, we started identifying, we started with where were people running up against some issues in Prefect, which is like a kind of a hard thing to talk about, obviously, because we love our product and we always want our product to be perfect. But our product was designed to go at least an order of magnitude past what you might find in comparable products. That was always our design goal. Chris and I both come from machine learning backgrounds. We wanted that to be sort of the level of scale that we handled. We didn't see that in the universe, and we designed for that scale. And no sooner did we put that in the world than, of course, people started pushing it even an order of magnitude past that. And people started doing crazy things with Prefect. I remember one day in Slack, someone showed up and they were like, hey, I built a recursive flow. And we were sort of like, no, that's not really a thing that seems possible. And they're like, yeah, here it is. It's a Fibonacci calculator. It's built entirely in Prefect. And there was this like wild kind of, well, how did you go around these limits? How did you do that? And we started pulling on this thread. And as people started putting these bigger and more complex things and really going beyond the limits of, what we consider the limits of a product to be, we started to wonder why those limits were even there at all. And in fact, as we really started diving in, we discovered that one limit was more confining than any other. And it was the fact that people had to create these precompiled DAG structures in order to communicate their instructions to the backend. And it seemed a little bit odd to us at the time, to say the least, to imagine a world in which one didn't precompile this DAG and instead everything sort of happened dynamically. But as we began to pull on that thread, every single thing in our Orion announcement and a whole bunch of stuff we haven't even announced yet, but maybe we'll touch on today, fell out of removing this constraint. We as a company, as a product, we've taken these precompiled DAGs because it seems to be the way this is done. I'll tell you, we don't do a thing with them. Every single feature we deliver, every single orchestration path that we have, they pretty much ignore the fact that we have this precompiled DAG structure. And so it really just became this constraint that users had to take on in order to send data to us in a known way. And so a lot of what we want to talk about today and explore, and I think what a lot of the questions are about, is how did removing that constraint enable so much interesting functionality in a really cool way? So I'm gonna pause there for just a moment, sort of where this all came from. Chris, do you want to talk for a bit about anything that is particularly on your mind that we want to get into today?
And before you guys do that, I'm going to pop out, but if anyone has any questions, please do put them in the chat and I'll pop back in and I'll ask them.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Chris, anything particularly on your mind?
Nothing. I mean, I'm very excited about a lot of different things, so I'm happy to launch into a monologue about what those things are. I guess I maybe I actually will just start here. I think the thing that I'm personally most excited about, that everyone, at least internal to Prefect, has probably heard me say ad nauseum, is just this idea that I do think we tried really hard to implement in current Prefect, of incremental adoption of the platform and the framework. And so, we've always said that you have to modify your code in a minimal possible way to get the features of Prefect. And it was one of the reasons a lot of our users, I think, enjoyed using the system, is it did feel very lightweight. But Orion, I think, takes that so much further. One of the things that I realized kind of when we were building a lot of this is that you can actually use another scheduler to schedule Prefect workflows, but still gain a lot of the benefits of Prefect, whether it's retry logic, caching logic, or just pure visibility. So one of the things that I know a lot of hobbyists like to do is you have a Python script, you want to put it on a cron schedule, and that is probably the right thing to do if you're just doing a little hobby project. But if you do that and drop a single flow decorator on the function that you're running, like your main function, essentially, you immediately off the shelf get a dashboard for your cron scheduler on whatever machine you're running it on. So if you care about, for example, proof of work, whether something succeeded or failed, and that's really all, and just making sure that it's running at the times that you think it is, literally one line of code, you get that off the shelf with Orion. And then, of course, you can kind of take it further. You can start to sprinkle in tasks. Not every single piece of logic needs to be a task when you first start, although, of course, you get a lot of benefits the more that you put in. But the fact that you can incrementally adopt those benefits is actually a really powerful way to get onboarded into the system, and is another one of the goals, too, for how Orion is going to work with, a platform like Prefect Cloud, which I'll hold off on going too deep on that for right now.
Yeah, well, I think maybe we'll definitely have some time to get to that. This whole idea of incremental adoption, it's funny because the way we talk about it is exactly the way you just did, right? It's like, you don't have to use our product. It's kind of bizarre. You only need to use the pieces of it that you want. And I think that sort of just feels a little funny to say, but we've always had this idea. I think it's like why we even started any of this in the first place. We always had this idea that we needed to meet people where they are. And there's no better way to do that than to say, keep using whatever tools you're using and just take the pieces of Prefect that are useful to you. And I mean, look, I think I have to make this plug, right? The system's more usable. It does more things the more that you use, of course. But you love cron, you're that person. I haven't met that person quite yet, but if you're that person, like, great, keep using cron. Just use Prefect for retries or whatever it is. It's kind of crazy, but it does actually work. So let's see. So do we want to dive in? We have some questions. Chris, maybe you and we can just talk about some of the things we announced. Ryder, do you want to start with one of the questions we got?
Yeah, why don't we start with talking about DAG, this concept of DAG free first. I think let's start with that. We don't have any questions in the live chat just yet, but we do have a list of questions we'll hit throughout this hour that people submitted through the community. But let's start with this concept of no more DAGs. I think this is really an interesting one that we've been talking about a lot internally.
Absolutely. Chris, you want to go? You want to go ahead?
Yeah, maybe I'll start, and then Jeremiah, you can cut in and add context and flavor as necessary. So the DAG freeness of Orion, I think, is probably one of the cooler aspects in what it unlocks. And so just to kind of set the stage for those of you who don't know exactly what we mean when we say that, in every other system, workflow system, including Prefect as it is today, you have to define what I would call an execution plan for your workflow, right? You have some set of root tasks, then they have downstream dependencies that trigger other tasks, and kind of keeps going, and you have this nice graph. And a big constraint is that graph needs to be directed. So, it starts somewhere and it ends somewhere, and acyclic. So you can't ever revisit a node once it is considered complete. There's probably an interesting history lesson in here for someone to dig up. I believe that this constraint comes out of static config files like YAML, which just by their very nature, require you to have this sort of execution plan in how you spell YAML. And so people kept adopting it and using it. And what we found, though, as Jeremiah alluded to at the beginning, is that just to do simple things, I'll use conditional branching as an example. You have to force and torture your code into this structure just so the workflow system can know about it. So in Prefect, we tout this a lot. We have conditional branching, and it's great. And what it means, though, is instead of writing an if statement, which is what you want to do, and we've seen people try to do it, and they get errors that confuse them, you have to use what's called a Prefect case operator, which is just an if statement. It's just a deferred if statement. So it's a placeholder for an if statement that's going to run when you actually run your workflow graph, and it has downstream dependencies. And if the if statement goes one way, then this runs, and otherwise this other thing runs, and vice versa. It's skipped. But it just feels weird that you have to do that. And you can imagine way more complicated control flow that you really have to torture to get in this. Another popular feature request that we've gotten that is really hard to imagine in a DAG world is the idea that if you have 3 tasks in a row and this one fails in a specific type of way, you might want to go review the upstream task, potentially with modified inputs. And now, in theory, and just to be pedantic here, you could create a DAG that represents that logic. Like I want to make sure that's clear. Like in theory, everything at the end of the day, of course, is a DAG when it is executed. But the fact that you have to confront that as you're building your workflow is really kind of silly. And as Jeremiah also said at the beginning, we do not use that. There's not a single feature that is provided based on that static knowledge. And in fact, task mapping, which is definitely one of our most popular features, actually avoids that static knowledge and still gives you all of the features of a workflow orchestrator: retries, observability, logs, caching, whatever else you may want. And each one of those dynamically spawned task runs gets its own ID at runtime. And we know how to retry those, even if you have to spin this up in a new process in the future. And so that was kind of the first key for how we were going to conceive of this kind of DAG-free world. And so now you really can implement Python control flow and whatever other sorts of kind of crazy workflow patterns you might want in essentially native Python code. There's like 1 or 2 minor changes you have to make, of course, to deal with the fact that these are Prefect tasks. But
yeah, and I think where this gets really interesting is sure, we can imagine a world where it's pure static DAGs, ET then L, great, life is good. And we can imagine this insane total anarchy world. But where this gets interesting are those on the margin, all you wanted to do was branch between 2 things. And instead you had to go read prefect docs to understand how to use our case operator. That's crazy. We want to get rid of that. We don't want you to think about that. You know how to write an if statement. Let's just, all right.
Another place too, this has come up that I think will be music to a lot of people's ears, is the idea that in certain situations at runtime, something happens and you just want to abort the running of the flow. And in a DAG world, you have to have a placeholder or a hook that does all of that detection and then does something special. And as Prefect users know, it's not completely easy to just say, I'm done here, don't proceed. But in Orion, you literally just return from your flow function. And no surprise, that ends the execution of your flow function. As simple as that. And so kind of the intuition you have for your code carries directly over.
And the example, you sketched a pretty abstract example there for a second, Chris, but we've seen it so many times from our users where obviously, I think probably many people listening to this have done this, right? You have some form of data validation. Maybe you use, we're great friends with the folks over at Great Expectations, just as one example, but you use some way of knowing the quality of data, or rather if there were any problems with your data. But what you do with that, almost always, the question all the time, well, now I need to rerun part of my steps. And that is really, really, really complicated to express if you need to do it in a DAG form. And we've sort of contorted Prefect in many ways to facilitate that and to make it feel like you can do that. But you're doing something very complicated in a DAG world that's trivial in the Pythonic world or scripting world that we all sort of want to live in. I think maybe that's sort of an interesting thing to pull on for a second, is that when you look at the execution of any code after the fact, of course it's a DAG. of course, it has to be a DAG. Things have to happen in a certain order, even if the code that generated them itself was, some more complex structure. I think the error that's been made in our industry, if you will, is forcing people to build that structure, which is the artifact of executing code, before the code is run. That's where this split happens. And that's why our DAG-free model nests DAGs, for lack of a better word, very nicely as just a really stable version of the type of workflow that we now support. In fact, Chris, you want to talk for a moment about like stable graphs and like how that's going to show up and lead to better experience?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of said it before, this idea of meeting users where they are, and that allows them to have this really graceful, ideally intuitive on-ramp into a whole platform or framework. And so, the question probably arises, well, what happens if I call random.random to do something? And the answer is it's going to do exactly what you think. It's going to run, and if you run it again, it's going to produce potentially a different random number if you're not setting seeds or something like that. And you might end up in a place that your graph, the second time you run it, is quite different. And it's important to note that while we don't recommend doing that, it is possible. And it's kind of a part of this whole philosophy that, like, on day one, you don't have to kind of confront this new framework and contort your code to match. And then we, of course, will have a set of best practices for making sure that, Jeremiah used the word stable graph. The best execution model that, will be handled by Prefect and really express the features, the orchestration features maximally, is one in which every time you run the function, the same nodes are revisited. And so there's a lot of subtlety in here that I don't want to spend like 10 minutes going through, but basically, if there's any piece of randomness, as long as you encapsulate that inside of a task, then your graph becomes stable from Prefect's perspective. Because the second time you run it, that task will be bookmarked as already succeeding with some return value that is now static and stable. And so whatever's happening afterwards can happen deterministically, even though what happened inside the task might have been random. And the catch there, though, is if that randomness leaks outside of something that Prefect manages, you could get yourself into trouble. And we're well aware of that, and it's something that we want to make sure is well documented. But so stable graph is kind of the key word to look out for there in our docs. And yeah.
And so while we're still in the concept of DAGs, I think we have a great question from the community. In general, I think that this idea of being DAG free or removing the requirement for a DAG just makes it easier or moving us more towards our users writing in natural Python, right? So I think being able to, an easier starting point. I think that Orion in general is easier to start with. Another question from Ben in our chat. So the removal of DAG seems like it doesn't save us from ourselves. He goes on to say that the change in paradigm seems like it would require some retraining. So I think those two things, this idea of just making it easier to get started by moving more towards natural Python coding, and then some people may rely on this concept of a DAG. Jeremiah, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I first of all, it's a great question, and this is part of what feels so like weird about this. But what I would assure you is, if you've seen the movie Dumbo, I'm sure many of us have, when he's holding that feather and he thinks that's how he can fly, that's the DAG. Like, you don't need this DAG to write good code. You just need to write good code. And the proof of that, as we've like sort of admitted here, is we don't use the fact that you built that DAG to do anything interesting in Prefect. We use the fact that you use structured data models and abstractions to tell you things about the validity of the workflow you're trying to do. And we can still do that. It's the DAG, the directed acyclic aspects of it, that we don't do anything with. So this Dumbo feather is real. And I think what we're doing with Orion, and one of the reasons that Orion is going to be released over a very long window, which we'll chat about exactly what that roadmap looks like, is because we realized that you don't want to take my word for it, that you can fly without that feather. It's very comforting to live in this world with a DAG, because we've all lived there for so long. We've all believed that that's all we can do. And then as soon as you see how easy it is to do more, it's amazing. So the most common thing we hear when we say, oh, there's no more DAGs and we do everything dynamically, is, well, how do we do a visualization of the workflow if we're not pre-compiling. It's actually real easy. We just don't run the tasks and we just run through them and we visualize it for you. And if it's a stable graph, the way Chris just described it, it's exactly the same functionality in exactly the same runtime as you would have with a full DAG structure, but we didn't need the DAG structure. So in addition, if you want to throw an if statement in there, or you want to do whatever else you would do in Python. In fact, if you want to run code that is not a task, it's not governed by Prefect, you're more than welcome to. And so this is a strict expansion of what you can do, but it doesn't change what we're able to do with those stable graphs Chris was just talking about. And once you see it's like a feather, it just doesn't matter. You can fly without it. The world just really opens up in a cool way.
And there's actually something else in the announcement blog post that is kind of important here, which is oftentimes, if not all the time, you start with an outcome that you have already coded for, and then kind of towards the end of that development cycle that you look to put it into an orchestrator's framework. And it's at that moment that you've already gone through whatever your best practices are for your use case, and having to refactor it and redesign it for the framework, of course, introduces like risk that you're changing something critical. And the word that I really like from the blog post is this idea of code as workflows, not workflows as code. The assumption being you're already having to think through the code and systems that you're dealing with. And once you have perfected that and made sure that it's robust, the orchestrator's job is just to kind of come in and delicately ensure that you get all of the observability and whatever other stateful execution patterns you need from your orchestrator, without forcing you to introduce new bugs by changing your code.
Yeah, unit tests are a lot better too when you live in this world, because you just run them. They're just functions now. You run them however you want.
Exactly.
So we've got another question. Jeremiah, you talked about timing. And so this one is for you, Chris. So we have a question from the community in the live chat right now. What should someone think about when they're choosing between pre-release Orion and then current generation Prefect? What does that timing look like?
Oh, that's a great question. So if you have an immediate need for a production use case and you need to deploy something, you should use current Prefect. Orion is still under very, very active development. And so there's going to be a lot of changes happening, potentially even some breaking changes. We don't necessarily have one planned right now, but you just never know. We want to leave open that possibility. What I would very much ask though is if you're excited by Orion, that you go use it as it is today and see whether you can express your workflow goals using its building blocks and give us feedback about that. And if you encounter any errors or anything, let us know. This is how we're going to be able to really perfect its design and performance. And the different screens, for example, that are being displayed in the UI, those are still under active development, and even some of them are still even being designed. And so any early feedback you can give us will really very much impact the direction that it goes. Or I shouldn't say the direction necessarily, but some of the details of how it really comes to be and matures. And so to answer the question more directly in terms of timing, we have a goal of getting Orion to a place where we can brand it a true release candidate. So we believe that it is ready to go live in production use cases by the end of the year. And then of course, we'll make some fanfare about that so people can go test it, etc. And then once we kind of get through that validation phase, maybe it's a month, roughly speaking, then we will brand it, as the sanctioned version of Prefect to use, with the idea and the implicit idea that I guess I haven't said out loud, that it will also be cloud compatible at that time, so that you can use, all of the features and services that cloud offers.
I love this. Sorry, I keep popping in and out, but I'm loving this.
That's
guys.
good.
This is hilarious. So another question from the community, and I love our transparency. So the question is someone who's getting ready to sign an enterprise agreement, do you expect to continue charging by task run once Orion is released, or will that look differently in the future? I think Jeremiah, you're probably the right person for that.
Yeah, and this is from Jessica. Jessica, I think we might have been chatting during Laura's live stream a couple of weeks ago. It's great to see you again. So we haven't finalized what pricing will look like when cloud becomes Orion compatible, but it will be substantially the same. The response to the pricing model we have has been pretty positive, especially the success-based aspects of it. So if anything, we expect that because not everything has to be a task, it could end up even being, for some of our smaller users, it could end up even being more favorable in the new world. Like, that's fine, that's great. There's more people using and enjoying our product. Enterprise pricing will be very much the same as our expectation now. Again, we haven't finalized it, but you can mention I said this in your sales call. I think that one thing we have done with a lot of intensity and a lot of intentionality is we have always, as a company, been really committed to honoring the agreements we make with people, whether it's contractual or APIs. You can run a Prefect 0.6. That's 2 years of releases ago against Prefect Cloud today, because we've kept that alive. We've kept contracts in place. We've honored pricing that we've done using the pricing changes. So I think I can say, I haven't, it's always when, I'm sure someone on my sales team is like, oh, why do you say that? But it's the truth. Pricing is pricing. It's designed to be fair. It's designed to be aligned, and we're not really looking to make any changes there. The changes we're making here are about delivering new features on top of what we can already do. The value delivery can be the same. The new features are where we hope to earn more business from our customers, but the core product does what it does, and the pricing's been pretty solid.
Awesome. So let's go into another question. This one's actually from before, when we asked for the community to submit questions via Slack. And so either one of you can answer this. Be interested to hear the answer to this question. How does Orion scale for flows with hundreds of thousands of tasks?
So I'll at least start with this one because I have a suspicion that I know who submitted it. So Brett, if you're out there, my guess is that you're wondering, our favorite 100,000 task workflow user. And okay, there's a few different ways that I want to answer it. So first and foremost, just the short and sweet is that it will definitely be more performant. I mean, Orion is async first, which already gives a little bit of benefits. And when you're running, I mean, implicitly, I think if this question did in fact come from a current user, that is almost certainly a workflow running on Dask. And so when you introduce async with Dask, by the way, is now async. Dask distributed is now async compatible, largely from some of our team's kind of questions and suggestions to the Dask core team. Can really improve your performance in your Dask cluster. You need fewer threads, et cetera, et cetera. The reason that I don't have a concrete answer or a benchmark to say today is largely because we focused a lot for this technical previews announcement on that local development and testing experience, making sure that it is just pristine. And so what you might, just to kind of get a little in the weeds here, the way Orion works when you go spin it up and you run it, let's say in an IPython session, is that in the background, an API object is being created that your code is talking to, and it's doing so in a stateful way. So what I mean by that is there's a database lurking all the way behind the API that you are in fact communicating with every single time you run your workflow, whether it's interactively in a unit test, doesn't matter. And there's ways, of course, bells and whistles you can configure so that your unit tests don't, compete with your other traffic, et cetera, which I'm happy to share with folks after this. And so I guess, so we haven't yet stood up the Orion API, for example, in a large deployed environment running with a large Dask cluster and tested at that exact scale. But what we have done is run Orion locally with local Dask executors on moderate scale, tens of thousands of tasks, and probably more importantly, tested that against the front end. Because I think at the end of the day, Prefect currently works well at pretty much, arbitrary-ish scale. And it's really the front end that people feel some of the pain of that scale. When those queries are being made, the pages sometimes can be a little slow to load. The schematic maybe can be harder to navigate because there's a lot of spurious tasks in there that you don't necessarily care a lot about. And that is definitely been validated in Orion. And I believe most of the work and code that Orion was built testing against that sort of scale. So tens of thousands of workflows, tens of thousands of tasks in each workflow. Pages are lightning fast. And also, I do want to just say just, because there are always these questions about where is our internal focus and things, that Prefect Cloud, as it stands today, there are a lot of performance things that we are actively working on squashing right now, both in the back end and in the front end. And so, our focus is still very much on Prefect Cloud and supporting it, maintaining it, and even improving it.
That was a very CTO answer to the question. I'll give a more succinct answer to the question. The answer is yes, but for a real reason, not just because I'm just saying things. I mentioned earlier that Prefect was designed to go one order of magnitude past what we were seeing. People push right past that. So with Orion, we decided not even to pick an order of magnitude. The explicit design goal for our UI, for the dashboard, for what's available in this alpha release, as a matter of fact, was we used the term scale invariant. We designed it so that whether you had one task or 1 million tasks, you could get value out of the UI. Now that's a very difficult thing to do, and it required us to make some really concrete design choices and experimentation. And I know Nicholas was testing even the early UIs against hundreds of thousands of tasks in a SQLite database, making sure it was still screaming fast, and it was, and it's been a huge push. But you'll see that show up. I think we probably had an original design goal for Prefect today where we were like, oh, it has to work for 1 million tasks, but I don't think, like, we didn't actually expect people to start doing that, and then they did, and all of a sudden, people were saying, well, it doesn't show all my tasks, and the schematic's broken, and it won't render. And we're like, yeah, we didn't honestly expect this degree of use, and so it's like, okay, we got to start from scratch. We need to design a system that really can visualize progress over 100,000 tasks in a new way. Gantt chart, not going to cut it. Showing a diagram of the flow, it's also not going to cut it because there's just too much to show. And so a lot of our focus now is on, does this flexible data structure let us zero people in to the parts, to the subgraphs of this larger thing, or subflows, which is a brand new concept we can talk about, where they can actually interact with their workflows in a meaningful and semantically interesting way. Because while we have now designed for this scale, actually interacting with these objects on that scale is a real challenge now that we have to deliver a great user experience against.
So talk more about subflows. That's interesting to me personally. And I guess any of the new concepts, I know that one of the questions submitted from the community was, will I still have to use agents? So talk about subflows, agents, and any other new concepts within Orion the community should know about.
Those are great questions. Chris, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I'll start. So there's a few things to unravel. I actually am glad you asked those two questions kind of together, even though they might not seem related. They actually are. A lot of the way that Orion works is through a very, deeply thought out bookkeeping system for your tasks, flows, deployments, which is technically a new named concept. And so subflows are a thing, and there's a few different aspects of subflows. In the technical preview, as it is released publicly right now, subflows are a bookkeeping feature. They allow you to have workflow code that you sometimes run in isolation as its own workflow, and other times want to reuse inside of other workflows just natively. You just have two flow functions, you call one inside the other, and you can nest these indefinitely, and they will just show up both as in the schematic as all of the tasks that you would expect, but also on each individual page, you go to the flow page for flow A, the flow page for flow B, and you will see dedicated runs that were produced. Now, the reason that this is related to agents and deployments and other things is that there's no registration step required anymore for workflows. They are uniquely identified by name. And so when you call a subflow, if it wasn't already pre-registered, it shows up on the page that you expect it to with its given name and a given run. And so first answer to the agent question is that no, they are not required anymore. And in fact, you can go, build your own effective agent that submit works ad hoc for you in some system. And as long as it has API access to your Orion API, everything will show up and be orchestrated as you expect. Now, agents are, however, necessary if you want to interact with Orion deployments, you know, in a first class way. So what is a deployment? A deployment is a specification for where a workflow lives and a specific version of that workflow. So maybe it's a Git commit SHA, you know, for a workflow that's stored in Git or on your local file system. Some sort of run config for how that workflow should be executed. Maybe it's a sub-process environment, maybe it's a Kubernetes, you know, job template, whatever the case may be. And then any parameter defaults that you may need. So it's all of that statefulness that you would expect to provide if you were registering the workflow as it is today in Prefect Cloud. And so deployments are a separate concept, and agents deal entirely now with deployments. So when you create a deployment, you now basically have a button. You can go quick run that deployment. You can go tweak the parameters of the deployment and run it via the UI. You can schedule deployments. And that's really where agents come in. So anytime you want any of that sort of feature and functionality. But if you don't need any of that feature and functionality, kind of going back to our iterative adoption of all of these features, then you don't need agents. If you're just experimenting, or if you're just running your workflows as Lambdas and you don't want to have to deal with setting anything else up, by all means, go for it. And now Subflows 2, I just want to call out, will additionally be the house new features. For example, not to get too far ahead of myself, the ability to mix and match executors as you're running your workflow. So if you have a parent workflow running in one executor, and then you have a subflow that maybe this doesn't need to get distributed on your DAS cluster and you want to keep it all in process, you will be able to do that and specify that in exactly using the same interface that you specify executors on any other flow. It's just flow function has its own config. You call it, that config gets respected.
I'm really glad. Really glad you brought that up, because that was actually a community question, I think, from earlier in the Slack. Can I run things, you know, locally and then maybe at scale, distributed at scale? So what I'd like to address next is the roadmap for Orion. So I think we've got a release out there today. Right now, people are running things locally. Can you guys address general timeline, as specific as you can get, and I think what you're hoping to improve, change, and where you want to get to?
Sure. So Chris already mentioned the short-term goal is that over the next quarter, we're going to take the Orion engine and get it ready for production use, which means when you're running something in what will become Prefect 1, which is Prefect Core today, Prefect 2 will become a viable option for you. The UI will be ready. We'll have deployment patterns. It'll be well tested. It'll be robust. It'll have, you know, our full support. That's something that we're hoping to have ready for first quarter of next year, and that's the development work that's ongoing now. And for those of you who's looked at the alpha, the reason that we released it at this time is because the core structures are in place, which is to say, code as workflows exists. You write code, turns into a workflow. You can see it in the UI, you can run it, you can schedule it, you can do all kinds of stuff. But we've got a lot of expansion to do. We've got new agents to introduce. We've got new storage locations to introduce. We've got pages in the UI that we still want to introduce. We've got a lot of new features that we want to introduce. And of course, we want to make sure that this becomes compatible with our commercial platform, which is called Prefect Cloud. That's something that you can look to see betas become available in early next year. You'll see a full rollout of that as we get into next year. That's something that as our maintained production grade environment needs even an additional level of testing. It's going to inherit a lot of the security enhancements that we've gone through organizationally and logistically as a consequence of the work we did last year, SOC 2, and et cetera. There's an enormous amount of work to do there infrastructurally to make sure that that is in fighting condition. So that's our engineering team's focus at the moment over the next couple of quarters is advancing the public release to that level, and then of course introducing the platform release shortly behind it. And the model that we're using here, you know, there's no longer this choice, and this was one of the original design goals we laid out this year. There's no longer this choice of like, are you using Prefect Core? Are you using Prefect Server? Are you using Prefect Cloud? We're just like, there's no reason for this choice anymore. The only choice right now is, do you want to host the Orion engine, or do you want us to host the Orion engine? And we're going to have a really just a much better experience, not only not having to make that choice, but how you can swap between the two. How you can go, or both, exactly. How you can go from self-hosted and all of a sudden start running against cloud. How you can go from cloud and all of a sudden fall back or redirect onto a self-hosted Orion, for example, as a sandbox or for testing? Or I don't know if we want to explore some blue sky ideas. Chris, you want to just talk about some of like your plans for Prefect IDs and all that?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the goals here with Orion is, I mean, right? If you read the blog post, it's kind of a squashing of an orchestration environment, and one of the things that we do want to think about including. So, like, don't read into this. This is not something that anyone is writing code for today. Is making this a true sandbox environment, especially if you're running things on the platform. So if you need to debug something, for example, the code paths, first off, are going to be identical, which is a really big thing. People have probably noticed that if you switch from local to cloud or local to server or something, you get different code paths, which sometimes can cause some unexpected behavior. Code paths are not different. They're 100% identical now. And that's one of the kind of goals as we build new features. And so what you'll be able to do, though, is if you ran a workflow in Prefect Cloud, something weird went wrong, and you want to debug it further and maybe inspect some of the intermediate steps of your task, you'll be able to essentially download that run history to your local sandbox or IDE environment, and start to play with what happened and add breakpoints, and maybe even have an actual IDE set up so that you can tweak code natively in your Orion UI. We provide hints, type hints, hey, look out, this might not work the way you expect, sort of suggestions. You rerun whatever happened in cloud, you figure out your issue, you resolve it, you update your cloud deployment, and then you push it back out of your sandbox, back to cloud, and you're back off to the races. Now that, don't want to overpromise on that, but of really making it your go-to place to build, test, debug your workflows is definitely one of the design goals here, or product goals here.
One thing I want to like hit on there, Chris, is this is such an interesting product vision goal to me, because everyone can talk about what a good developer experience looks like. You ask anybody who's encountered any frustration in any product, and it always has something to do with like, well, it works on my machine. Right? I ran it here and it was fine, and then I put it over there and it was broken. And so I think we can all agree that improving the translation experience of any workflow in Prefect's world or any piece of software is a huge part of making the developer experience like first class and rock solid. They should be equivalent. They should, if it ran here, it should run there. How do we make guarantees about that? How do we deliver tools that help with that? What I have never seen anybody talk about, and that's why I'm so interested in this, is going the other way and bringing what happened in the deployment in the cloud down to your laptop for debugging. And this idea that you could wake up in the morning, see that an ETL pipeline failed overnight, push a button, set a breakpoint in that code, and walk through the exact same code with the exact same environment, with the exact same data on your laptop 12 hours later is a developer experience that I really, really, really want to deliver, and that the Orion architecture has been designed to enable. We have work to do to actually deliver that exact thing, but it is like a solid thing that I think would just be an incredible advancement. I mean, I think we've all lived in a world, or at least I've lived in a world in past lives, where I learned that a job failed. This is, to be clear, not using Prefect. This would be using an older system. Learned that a job failed. I've logged in to find it. The node it was running on crashed. And by the way, it took all my logs with it. So now, I don't know, am I in infrastructure land? Do I need to go to some other tool? Do I need to go to that? Like, that is the situation, which is the worst. That is the worst outcome of using an orchestrator, because the one thing that the orchestrator should do, if nothing else, is give you insight into failure and turn failure into first class experience. Everything else that we're talking about is, to be blunt about how we think about this internally, everything else we're talking about are costs that we ask our users to bear so that we can deliver that really good experience when we can be really valuable. And that's why I think a lot of you know about our mantra about negative engineering, and we think of our product as an insurance product. And this is why. If your code runs exactly the way you want on your local machine and in the cloud, I don't know, you probably don't need us, or you probably can get by with very few of our features, because what are we really doing for you? We're giving you a UI for your runs. We're helping you schedule them maybe. But if anything unexpected happens, we can be really, really, really helpful. And so our entire ethos is organized around that philosophy, that in order for us to be helpful, we have to meet users where they are. We have to make this easy. We have to stop asking users to, for example, create DAGs, which, like, as Chris and I say, both of us with math backgrounds, the idea that our users know what a DAG is sort of absurd. It has no place in this. It's ridiculous. So we want to get rid of that. There's no reason for it. There's no reason to burden users with it. Our users are really amazing engineers, and they should be really amazing engineers. And we are really good at identifying that negative engineering experience. And our product, and this evolution of our product, that's its product mission, is to deliver that, minimizing the cost for users to adopt it. So anyway, classic detour on my part, but that's really important to me.
And I just, something that I also want to call out, back on the theme of the developer experience, because I saw Ben commented in the chat, and I know I've been asked this a lot about current Prefect, is something that in current Prefect, I think we maybe took too much for granted, is this idea that it was easy to test. We said it a lot, but we never provided a lot of guidance for what we meant by that. I think we just kind of assumed that, you know, like bluntly, I think we maybe just assumed it was too obvious, and that ended up actually not being a correct assumption. And so one of the things too with Orion that we definitely, I mean, we already do because we tested ourselves, of course, a lot, is provide more first-class testing hooks so that, you know, you can really stand up robust testing frameworks and things like that as a part of that, you know, dev experience.
And I think
it's critical.
Chris, I think it's worth mentioning here also for folks who are trying to think about, like, what is the split in the world that we're laying out here? Like, why is this an exciting world? What about Prefect as it is? I want to reiterate this idea that this is about an expansion and enhancement of a core set of things that we're delivering today. If you want to live, and maybe you do, in a largely like DAG-based, batch-scheduled, regularly scheduled world, then great. A lot of Orion's functionality will be invisible to you, and you'll take your Prefect 1 code and you'll change your with blank as flow to an at flow and delete your registration line. And that's the extent of your migration. And now you're running on Orion infrastructure and just gaining a lot of the infrastructural benefits that we can deliver. And that's totally fine. We can live in that world and never take a step forward. But for those of our users who are building Fibonacci sequences out of flows and trying to use streaming data and frustrated by trying to do conditions over mapped tasks, which we support, but you have to really go in and learn how to take advantage of the system to deliver it. Those users are going to find a really enhanced toolkit. And I think that's what I'm most excited about, is those are the types of workflows that we are seeing as a consequence of the other awesome tools in the stack that people are adopting. And data's coming faster, and there's more of it, and it's coming at unpredictable times, and experimentation is happening, and, you know, hyperparameter optimization is requiring really interesting concurrency and validation patterns. And we need to make sure that our orchestrator is as flexible as the use cases, because otherwise we will fail to meet users where they are going.
So actually, you just brought up a really good point that I'm surprised. I mean, maybe someone did pre-submit this as a question, but I hadn't heard about it yet. Streaming. A lot of our users are moving to streaming tech stacks. And one of the things that honestly I would just ask people to do is wire up some streaming use cases to Orion, because you don't need an agent anymore to get that first class orchestration experience. And you can just call your workflows with various parameter payloads. And maybe even inside the workflow, you're pulling off of a stream. You know, I would ask the users who are already living in that streaming world to kind of help ideate with us about what are the hooks that Prefect could be exposing that would make standing up a streaming workflow easier, because Orion is definitely designed in such a way that all we need to do is figure out where those hooks are, but otherwise, you know, at the scale, speed that streaming requires, we'll be good to go.
So let's throw out a completely just like made up, but completely using primitives that exist in Orion today in its alpha to build on. You could set up an infinitely long running flow run. Infinitely, it just never ends, while true. Pulling events off a queue, firing off a dynamic set of conditional tasks in response to them, and maybe even changing its own behavior and definition in response to a value that you set in itself as an application, in a third-party system, and whatever. I mean, what are you gaining from this? You're getting, first of all, observability into this streaming stack. We have an open question on what are people's expectations around retries here. So if you're dealing with millisecond latencies, retries are going to be a little bit weird. They're very doable, but they're going to be kind of weird to figure out the semantics of. If you're dealing with slower latencies, they're going to make a ton of sense. You can retry part of your streaming pipeline just like that. Prefect will do it. So those are sort of the primitives we're bringing to bear here, and we are very curious to see how people want to apply them. And I can hear in saying this, I'm already inviting that next level, that next order of magnitude for Orion, which is going to necessitate, a new product 10 years from now. But we're curious to see what people want to do with that, because it's very doable.
And I was just going to ask you, Jeremiah, I guess, what are the next things beyond streaming that you guys, I think that where our community could push us towards? Do you have any kind of ideas or predictions around there? Anyone brought anything else up to you beyond streaming?
So I have many ideas. Here's what I'm going to share. We have a task library right now. It's really awesome because it just keeps growing as we and the community continue to submit tasks into it, and each task represents sort of a discrete thing that you can do. Maybe it's a source of data, maybe it's sync for data, maybe it's transformation of data. The introduction of flows as functions and subflows means that we're actually going to be introducing a subflow library, so that you don't just have to wire up a source and a sync. You can actually import a completely configured and out-of-the-box, ready-to-go Prefect workflow, and then just drop it into any other workflow you have, or call it on its own. And then, needless to say, once we have prepackaged subflow library, now maybe we don't even need code for you to deploy them and schedule it. Like, there's a whole world that comes with the repackaging of this utility into a flexible format. But that's a direction that I'm very, very interested to explore for the next year.
So something that I'm both interested in and we have gotten direct questions about is the idea of multi-language support. So I definitely don't want to overpromise here. There's a lot of things to think through, but the way that Orion was designed is, as Jeremiah said, I guess at the very beginning, API first. So all of the true work is happening behind the API, and the client is just responsible for, producing some of these stable bookkeeping artifacts. Like, here's a stable ID that identifies this bit of code, things like that. And so there is a future where we could do multi-language orchestration. We've gotten requests for R. Go actually has been one that has come up more than I would have predicted beforehand. So yeah, that's on my mind. Like, what is that truly going to look like? Is it going to be equivalent to the experience in Python, or just a thin wrapper? Open questions, but it's an exciting direction.
Yeah, that's going to be very, very cool to see how that plays out.
Absolutely. So as we have 5 minutes left, guys, just so you know, and as we're wrapping up, we got another good question from the community. So this is from Chris Fruman. The debugging feature sounds awesome, but curious, how would this be handled for data we're passing through Prefect that we don't want stored there?
So
Jeremiah, you want to take that? Chris,
go ahead. Great question.
Yeah, I guess the short and sweet answer is similar in spirit to today, where you can configure these locations where your data is stored, and the Prefect API only maybe knows something about their metadata location. It's not going to work exactly the same way, but in spirit. So when you pull it down, as long as you have the credentials to pull from wherever that data is stored outside of the Prefect ecosystem, then you'll be able to rehydrate locally, et cetera. So the debugging feature doesn't require Prefect Cloud itself to have stored that data, only that it has stored a reference to that data that you can then pull on your local machine.
Yeah, this is not just like a side effect or consideration of ours. This is the way the Prefect works, and today it's the only way the Prefect works. We do not, our managed platform, we do not take in code. We do not take in data. Makes it so easy, like push a button to deploy Prefect in fintech and healthcare and a lot of industries that have historically struggled to adopt SaaS products. We don't take it. We don't want it. And the really amazing thing is that we can nonetheless deploy this architecture that supports this type of activity without ever seeing the data. Just to borrow my metaphor from earlier, the idea that we need access to code and data, it's another Dumbo feather. We don't. We can deliver the same functionality by working in a intelligent way with our users, with our customers to deliver that. It's worth mentioning that we do want to explore, in particular for some of our smaller customers who do not maybe have the same privacy concerns and at scale, we do want to explore offering fully managed services for Prefect Cloud. That's something we'll be talking about next year. It's a really, really important stepping stone for a lot of our users who otherwise, look, everything we're talking about today is removing frictions in gaining access to orchestration. So very much something that we're talking about as a product team.
Yeah, a lot of revelations here on this fireside chat, which is amazing. So look, about 90 seconds each to close, and then we'll close it.
I think the most exciting thing for me is I personally love building tools, and tools are only as good as the thing they're used to build. So one thing that I sort of say often to a lot of our customers is Prefect's not a hero product in the stack. We don't want to be a hero product in the stack. We're a product that people reach for because they have important work that they want to make sure it gets done. And that is really awesome to live in that world and to embrace that world, because when we do our job well, it means that the hero products in the stack, the like canonical products that are producing the analytic or whatever that we're helping govern, shine and do their job really well, especially when it comes to handoffs and all those spaces where the negative engineering and the sort of lack of ownership becomes really manifest. So for me, I guess as someone who cares deeply about building tools, seeing not just the interest in applying Prefect to new use cases, but the number of use cases that people have forced Prefect 1 to be applied to, necessitating a complete reexamination of our design philosophy in order to now deliver a product that supports them in a first-class way. That's really awesome. And that is what I'm very excited that we're able to deliver here.
So I am most excited, and this might be slightly selfish, but that's okay. So for those of you who have been around for the last 3.5 years, you probably know I really like to roll up my sleeves and just like get in there, solve user frustrations, like hear about use cases, and really use that to guide the direction that the product takes. And so Orion, very selfishly, is kind of my chance to do that again. We get to, rebuild this with a way larger community that is, even more engaged than the early days. And so I guess I would just put out just another request, like, please go use it. Don't be shy. Give us feedback. Test out interesting new use cases like streaming and things like that. And we just would love to hear from you, and feel free to, contact us, directly to chat more about some of the stuff. But building and kind of really, one of the reasons we released it as a technical preview is so that we could do this, right? We want to hear from you in the days where there's still a little bit of ambiguity about some of these features and hooks. So.
Yeah, you know what? Every couple of weeks we meet as a large team and review every piece of feedback that we get. We review what we hear in Slack from our community. We review what we hear in QBRs. So those of you who are customers of ours know we take that engagement really, really, really seriously. We review every single piece of feedback. And for months now, we had to introduce a new category for our response, which was Orion. This will be handled in Orion. This will be handled in Orion. This will be handled in Orion, over and over and over and over and over. I think that's why we're so excited. And so being able to deliver that against the community's requests, watching the community grow, I think, Chris, we're going to cross like 10,000 people in that Slack any moment, which is insane. It's just wonderful, and we're just grateful for all the interest, and we'll build this new system together.
Well, thank you both, Chris and Jeremiah, and we're going to wrap it up here. We'll see you guys in Slack.
Cool.
Thanks,
Chris.
Thanks, everybody.